Thank you very much, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I know we're the last panel of the day, but as we've been talking in advance of this, we think we're the best panel of the day. So I appreciate all of you who have made the time to be here with us today. We're going to get right into it here shortly, but there's just one thing I got to do. My good friend Kevin Brown, who's up making everything work here. Can we just have a round of applause for Kevin? He kind of keeps everything going. Partnerships to prosperity. I think as we've been listening over the last day, and if you were at the True North Forum yesterday as well, the same topic. And whenever we're talking about natural resource development in British Columbia these days and for many years, it's always come down to this one piece around what's the partnership look like? How do we get there? How does it become meaningful? And you know, it's an absolute pleasure and an honor for me to sit up here with these fine folks and as CEO of the Trust to tackle this topic and see if we can unpack it a little bit. Everything that we do as an organization is absolutely dependent on partnerships. Nothing, we could achieve absolutely nothing if it wasn't for the people that we work with in communities on a regular basis. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from each of you this afternoon and then also responding to some of your questions that come in from Pigeonhole. So make sure you're using your phones, you're logged in, and you're sending those questions in after we get through our presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly introduce our four esteemed guests, and then I'm going to invite each of them from their chair to provide a few comments, as you've seen here today, and then we're going to roll right into the questions, so be ready for that. So immediately to my left is Maynard Angus, Manager of Public and Community Relations at the Prince Rupert Port Authority. Maynard joined the Port of Prince Rupert in 2007 as the Manager of Public and Community Relations. In September 2016, Mr. Angus transitioned from his previous position to lead the Port of Prince Rupert's development and implementation of Indigenous engagement initiatives. Prior to joining the Port, Maynard was the founding and operating manager of Community Futures Development Corporation in Prince Rupert. Mr. Angus is married to Janice and has two children, Madeline and Leland. Would you please welcome Maynard?
Oh, we're supposed to sit.
All right. Well, I have 8 minutes. I'll get right into it. Imagine what Canada would be like if there was no such thing as the Indian Act, reserves, traditional territories, and memories of the residential school. Imagine if these words did not exist in our vocabulary. Consultation and accommodation, rights and title, UNDRIP, free, prior and informed consent, truth and reconciliation. Imagine how different life would be. You may recall there was a time when business believed that they were doing the Indigenous communities a favor. As the Indigenous communities, they sensed the shift that now most elected leaders and hereditary chiefs today believe they are doing big business a favor by allowing them to be on their traditional territory. So today, Canadian businesses are adjusting, and corporate Canada wants to understand the Indigenous culture of reconciliation, focused on the relationships. On the opposite side of the spectrum, for some of you, believe it or not, the Indigenous communities want to understand corporate Canada and why it functions in a world of resolution. You see, these two words challenge engagement, reconciliation and resolution. Reconciliation focuses on the relationship. The Indigenous communities are asking businesses to get to know them, whereas resolution focuses on the daily problems that need to be solved to ensure the speed of business is maintained. I believe the challenge is not building the relationship, but the problem is not taking the time to understand one another's culture. You may recall the adage, what you're not up on, you're down on. If you are not up on their culture, you will be down on it. If the void between the two cultures, the Indigenous and the corporate, persists, the smoldering issues will continue and flare up and become ablaze. The Prince Rupert Port Authority has recognized the challenges of engagement, and we faced it head on. We believe our relationships were built. We believe our relationships outside of the boardroom and the band office were built outside. We got to know one another over a cup of coffee or just breaking bread together in the feast hall. The Prince Rupert Port Authority's desire to have genuine and purpose-driven conversations with all levels of the community, from the elected leaders to the hereditary chiefs. Understanding Indigenous culture continues to be our focus. Meeting with the unassuming elders, and using the corporate verbiage, dormant stakeholder, let me repeat that. Meeting with the unassuming elders is just as important, if not more important, than meeting with the elected chief and council in the band office. When I'm asked, how's life at the Port of Prince Rupert? My usual response is, it's like building the plane and flying it at the same time. So who has time to stop and think about relationship building when businesses live in a world of timelines and resolutions, a world where corporations are required to produce and solve daily problems that will only escalate if unresolved? Are you in that mode, building your plane and flying it at the same time? You may want to hit the proverbial pause button and think about what is the right thing to do, as opposed to what is the best thing to do. These two trains of thoughts will dramatically change the way you conduct business. Are you doing the best thing, or are you doing the right thing? For business to succeed, you had to do the best thing. Today, you need to do the right thing. If this hasn't sunk in, come and see me later. When corporate Canada and Indigenous leaders do not take the time to build a meaningful relationship, the negative impact can affect all Canadians. If corporations do not have the trust with Indigenous leaders, they will forever be challenged to persuade or influence them to come to the table. Today, corporate Canada is hearing the verdict and realizing that there are paradigm shifts, and doing business on the traditional territory of the Indigenous people is the new norm. As stated earlier, when building a relationship, it should involve breaking bread together. Breaking bread is where big business and Indigenous leaders come together in a familiar place. Let's call this place the third space. The third space could be a restaurant, a coffee shop, or even sitting around the campfire. Your conversations in a third space will improve your future discussions in the band office or the boardroom. So take the time to build a relationship and get to know the traditional holders of the land. Now, for the Indigenous leaders, you must, and I repeat, you must recognize that businesses wants to understand our culture. Debatable? Probably. The Prince Rupert Port Authority recognizes the need for early conversations with the Indigenous communities, and that the discussions must be ongoing. We recognize and acknowledge that the conversations must occur before any decisions are made that allows projects to proceed, and we invite community members to provide feedback freely on port operations. Because our destination is not always the band office. Our goal is to engage with the community. So for this reason, we believe the Prince Rupert Port Authority's relationship with the Indigenous peoples is valued. We believe our understanding of the needs of each community has improved. The relationship the port has established have provided us with an open line of communication, as well as eliminated many barriers that has made it easier for both parties to come to a resolution. If you truly want prosperity through partnerships, both the Indigenous culture and the corporate culture must get to know one another. You see, the past 250 years of Canadian history hasn't been too kind to the Indigenous people. They are tired of being viewed as a project. It's time to improve the relationships and come together out of a world of perception where everyone thinks they know something about their culture. In closing, the relationship established between the Prince Rupert Port Authority and the Indigenous communities has become the foundation for economic opportunities in northern British Columbia and Canada. So, to ensure continued prosperity in this country, we must work together and strive to understand one another's culture. And if you don't, it will eat you for breakfast. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Maynard. That was some powerful comments, and I can see we're already starting to drive some questions. So on to our next panelist, Mr. Puetter. You can speak from your chair or you can speak from the podium, absolutely up to you, but let me introduce you first. You know, if I talk through this entire bio, I might take your entire 8 minutes. This man is impressive. Mr. Juergen Puetter is the CEO of Renewable Hydrogen Canada. I'm just going to hit the high notes here. In 1977, he started Bionair. In 1992, he started Hydroxyl Systems. In 2003, he founded Aeolus Wind Power. In 2008, he founded Blue Fuel Energy. In 2008, the federal government appointed him to serve as chair of Sustainable Development Technology Canada. In 2010, the Premier appointed him to serve on the Musqueam-Kachika Advisory Board. In 2012, he founded the Canadian Methanol Corporation, and in 2018, he founded Renewable Hydrogen Canada. If any of you have ever had the good fortune to have a conversation with Juergen, he is a man who knows about building partnerships in the resource sector in British Columbia. Will you please welcome Juergen?
Sounds more impressive than it is. Thank you very much. I'd like to take the opportunity to give you a little bit of a background how I got into the current partnership we have in the northeast of BC, because as you can tell from my accent, I'm originally not Canadian. I was born in Europe, in Switzerland, grew up in Germany. When I came to Canada, I was quite amazed at the resources we have here and how wonderful of a land it is, and I'm a very proud Canadian. In 2003, the BC government decided that independent power producers could, for the first time, provide energy in the form of wind energy, and there was no such project. So we set out, and ultimately we built the first wind project in Dawson Creek, the Bear Mountain project. And that got me, for the first time in my life, engaged with First Nations, and I built relationships. I didn't know about UNDRIP and all these things. It was beyond my knowledge. But I tried just, well, these are normal people. I seem to get along with them. Let's build relationships. I can report that by now I've been able to build personal friendships with many of them. I've been privileged to be invited to go on a sweat lodge with them, fly with them, take them around and spend time, break bread, as you say. And we built these relationships over many, many years. And most recently now, we have a new project, which is the one I'd like to talk about. I don't know if there's a screen out there where you can see anything on it. But this project revolves around using natural resources in a different way than what we've been hearing mostly at this conference. So the raw input is renewable energy in the form of wind, which we have in great abundance in BC. And what's also interesting, about 2 years ago, wind energy became more inexpensive to produce than regular electricity that BC Hydro would produce from dams. So that's a significant change. And we have a very large amount of stranded energy. At the same time, City of Vancouver decided to restrict the use of natural gas and trying to force people to no longer cook and heat with natural gas, but go to electricity. So the utility in Vancouver that distributes the gas throughout BC, Fortis, found itself with a prospect that their sales for natural gas would be decreasing. The answer would be to use renewable natural gas, typically produced from biomass, but there just isn't enough to achieve the requirements that are now occurring in the market. Then more recently, BC government put the new BC Clean Policy in place, which by 2030 demands that 15% of the natural gas in BC be renewable. That would require roughly 30 to 50 petajoules of energy. It's an enormous amount of energy. And the consensus appears that maybe 5 petajoules could come from biomass. So there's clearly a lack to achieve all this. So the solution we've proposed and have closely worked with First Nations is, why don't we take the renewable energy we have currently in BC in the form of stranded wind projects, build dedicated projects, convert the electricity into hydrogen by splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen, inject the hydrogen into the gas system, and thereby diluting the natural gas with hydrogen to reduce the carbon intensity. And without going into too much chemistry, natural gas is CH4. There's a carbon molecule and 4 hydrogen. When you burn it, you take the oxygen from the air, and the H and the O form H2O and energy, and that's what we want. And the C forms CO2, which we don't want. If you put hydrogen in it, you have the first two and not the CO2. So it's a very simple process, very little change required, and we needed locations for that. So I have close relationship with the folks at West Moberly, and Clarence Wilson, who's been on the council for a long time, brother of Chief Roland Wilson, and I have become, I would like to say, close friends. And I proposed to him 5 different sites, and always said no, no, no. And finally said, well, look, this is pretty difficult. How can we get somewhere? He said, why don't you ask me? So I said, okay, Clarence, where do we go? So he turned around, there was a map behind him, and says, right there. That's where the project is being built. It was by far the best location. I didn't have the local knowledge, they had it. And it was next to the pulp mill, that the Paper Excellence pulp mill, which is now shut down. So that had rail, substation, water, all the components were there and close to the gas pipeline. So it was by far the best location. We didn't figure it out, he did. So it is interesting that going back 10 years ago, which is how long we've been dealing with them, it was their input that enabled the whole project. Now, what is in it for the First Nations? In typical projects, like we had in wind projects and many of these, there are some benefit agreements we have, there's some cash goes out, there's some employment opportunities, but all of them are sort of marginal. We have here something which we believe is as revolutionary as the fact that we're now adding gas into the pipeline, namely the process of electrolysis generates heat. It's not fully efficient. So if you put 100% energy in, about 70% or so of the energy goes into hydrogen. The rest manifests itself as hot water. We've made a deal where I give First Nations 100 acres of land for $1, plus all the energy from the project, which is roughly 30 to 40 megawatt of hot water. That allows very, very large greenhouses under the moniker of Sundance to be built up there to grow organic produce. And this project will be 100% First Nation owned. Not 5%, not 50, 100%. So we provide the land and the input. So therefore, in order to grow produce, you wouldn't do that in a peace region. When it's minus 40, you go quickly bankrupt trying to heat a greenhouse. But if the energy is free and the land is free, and you have a fully First Nation-owned business, you can now build a very, very large business. We contracted Stantec to do a test as to what would the economics look like, and it's extraordinarily attractive. A project like this has a 4-year payback, and there would be long-term cash flows. And since we're not extracting any energy source, because wind is really solar energy, it's renewable, there's a long-term prospect that these projects could go on as long as we will need energy. And hydrogen will obviously not be the major component of our energy in the short term, because we need too much. But given what BC has, we see a very, very large opportunity there. And phase 2, so phase 1 is injecting hydrogen into the gas grid, and then shipping it down to Vancouver and reducing the carbon intensity. And phase 2 will be to make the hydrogen into methanol by conversion with CO2. And then you have a liquid hydrogen carrier, and you can export that to markets like California, Korea, and Japan, and we're working on that. Again, all of these will provide more energy and even larger greenhouses. And just to give you a feel of the scale, the first greenhouse would be large enough to full-time employ 250 First Nation jobs. So this is something we have an MOU with West Moberly. We're in discussion with other First Nations on a quite advanced stage as well. And we expect this is going to be the beginning of a new industry where we're not only making renewable power, displacing CO2 in a meaningful way, probably 500,000 tons per year initially, growing then beyond that, and also providing employment with First Nations, good partnership. And on top of that, what we think is so attractive is that it gives them total independence. It's truly an attractive thing, and we're doing something good for the planet. So that's roughly the overview.
That's a fantastic overview. Thank you very much, and I can see it's already started to result in more questions. So thank you very much, Juergen. We'll move on to our next panelist now, and of course, Mr. George, you can sit from your seat or take the podium. Mr. Dan George is the President and CEO of Four Directions Management Services. Dan has been assisting communities, organizations, governments, and companies through negotiation and strategic facilitation for 30 years. Dan brings his vast experience in MA in conflict analysis management, certification as a professional facilitator, and director certification through the Institute of Corporate Directors to each project he manages. Dan resides in Kamloops on Simpcw territory. He is a proud member of the Gilsayu clan, Big Frog Thin House of the Wet'suwet'en people, his family originating in an absolutely gorgeous part of this province, Hagwilget Village. He has been married for 33 years to his wife Teresa, and together they have 2 daughters, Amanda and Brittany, 2 granddaughters, Kiana and Aaliyah, and 1 grandson, Daniel. Will you please welcome Dan?
Thank you very much. Sure is bright up here.
Yes.
Seeing all you out there. I want to begin by acknowledging Lheidli T'enneh territory that we're gathered on here today. I raise my hands in respect to the elders, the matriarchs, the good people of this territory for hosting us here for this very important conference. A lot of work, collaboration seems to be the buzzword, and collaboration at its core means co-labor. What does that mean in practice, right? So many of us here, if you look at the networking that is going on, many of us here are devising ways and means to align our efforts for greater impact. We well know that most organizations and communities are feeling intense pressure to cut budgets, maintain programming, keep morale up, and improve our results. Across the board, from Indigenous nations to government agencies and from the nonprofit sector to business communities, stress is high and hope is oftentimes in short supply. It is clear that doing the same things the same ways and expecting different results is more than crazy, it is harmful. Over the years, our cycles of dysfunction and ineffectiveness arose from 4 common causes. No clear or motivating vision uniting everyone in a common purpose, so where are we going together? A lack of communication, common refrains that we've heard is, no, I didn't know, nobody told me. A mix of ego and historical complacency and mistrust amongst the parties. And focusing on transactions that are based on give and take rather than positively transforming our relationships with each other, relationships founded on respect, recognition, and reconciliation. The great news, though, is that there are now many examples of partnerships that have created unprecedented results by intentionally tearing down real or imagined silos, engaging everyone at every level in a shared vision with common values and a measurable action plan that furthers the vision, sharing power and distributing leadership across the table, establishing decision-making rules, essentially deciding how to decide, setting in place mechanisms for reciprocal accountability, embracing a solution orientation to your shared work, and using our conflict as a unifying force rather than having our conflicts separate us on the land base once again. And last but not least, strategically empowering everyone in the partnership to make suggestions and take ownership in that vision. And I have watched these partnerships, I've had the pleasure of working with you in this room. I've watched these partnerships benefit by letting go of historical turf wars for the good of the partnership and the people that we are formed to serve, being crystal clear on where the partnership is going and how it proposes to collaboratively leverage opportunities and dampen challenges. And I want to take a brief moment to illuminate 2 examples of effective collaboration that I am proud to be associated with. A number of years ago, the provincial government created an initiative called the Environmental Stewardship Initiative. It was an investment of $30 million trying to address cumulative impacts that were contemplated for major resource projects on our territories. And it brought together hereditary, elected, and government officials to collaboratively design land and water-based projects that address cumulative effects. And that was accomplished through generating trusted data to inform shared decisions on the land base. A second initiative that I'm proud to be associated with is the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. Their stated vision is member First Nations working collaboratively, cooperatively, and cohesively towards the enhancement of the economic well-being of our respective memberships, understanding that a strong economy is reliant upon a healthy environment, supported by vibrant cultures, languages, and expression of our traditional laws. They accomplish this work through partnerships between First Nations, industry, and all levels of government. As these 2 initiatives developed, I have watched as the vision began to grow and gain momentum and take root in the communities. The resulting enthusiasm became almost virally contagious, and as teamwork and results were elevated to unprecedented levels, more and more people wanted to get involved. We all want to be a part of something that is successful. Now imagine that positive kind of virus infecting and connecting all of us in this room. Imagine knocking down walls that are limiting your success. Imagine accessing more funding because of stronger partnerships you have with one another. Imagine having more knowledge and support for your projects because of mutually beneficial relationships. Imagine increasing education, quality of life, environmental stewardship, economic participation, and workforce development in the communities that you operate in. All of this is possible. If you look around this room, you will see that you all have high skills and a broad sphere of influence. Our shared responsibility must be to pull together and be part of something that is bigger than ourselves, bigger than our individual projects, and bigger than our organizations or our communities. Make no mistake, I want to be really clear on one point. Your Indigenous partners are a business imperative, not a business impediment. It just makes good business sense to share the risks and rewards arising from activities on the territories, and what better way to do that than with the original inhabitants of these lands. Now more than ever, we need one another to succeed. None of us are as smart as all of us. Collaboration is truly our path to the shared success that has eluded all of us for far too long. At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, none of us can accomplish anything worthwhile and impactful alone, and if we could, it wouldn't be any fun anyways. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to stand before you today to talk about this very important subject. And the last point that I want to make is I don't think about prosperity necessarily. I think about wellness and resilience for our communities and our people. Masai.
Thank you very much, Dan. So on to our last but certainly not least speaker. Sitting at the far end from me is Lindsay Thompson, Director of Indigenous Relations from BC Hydro. As the Director of Indigenous Relations, Lindsay oversees the implementation of BC Hydro's Indigenous Relations strategy. Lindsay's team conducts consultation and engagement on over 400 capital projects throughout British Columbia, including the Site C Dam project, the biggest in British Columbia's history. She is well versed in the planning and execution of major projects and directly managed more than 30 capital projects during her time in project delivery at BC Hydro before joining the Indigenous Relations team. Lindsay has both a master's and a Bachelor of Arts degree from UBC and holds a project management professional certificate as well. Will you please give a warm welcome to Lindsay?
Thank you. I just wanted to start by acknowledging that we're on the traditional territory of the Clay-Clay-Tenay First Nation. Working for BC Hydro is definitely very interesting. As many of you would know, BC Hydro built its major heritage assets in a time when engagement and consultation was not required and didn't really exist. The impacts of our big build era and a lot of our heritage assets have had devastating and ongoing impacts on Indigenous territories and land, and continue to do so. BC Hydro has been very open and public about what these impacts are and has apologized for them. And that's not to take away any of the impacts that the company has had. The reality and nature of our work is that we still continue to have impacts on the land. We're still continuing to build, we're still continuing to provide electricity for customers all across the province, and we're building off of those heritage assets in order to do that. When I was thinking about this panel and thinking about partnerships, and we've heard a lot today from different people around relationships, and I think that relationships are really at the root of any partnership. And for me, when I'm thinking about relationships, I really approach things, unscripted. So the script that people wrote for me today didn't end up on the stage with me. And I think relationships are built on honesty and trust. And some of the questions that we'll get to in the Q&A talk about, well, how do you build trust? And from my personal experience and just the way I operate in my life, is by being honest, right? Like, I will tell you who I am and who I am not, what I know and what I don't know. And if there's something that I know that I can't tell you, then I'll tell you that as well. And, relationships, they're hard and they're challenging. And I think they're particularly challenging working in the resource sector and working for a company that builds and has impacts on lands. And the reason I do it is because I want to do it the right way. And I want to listen and understand and hear other perspectives. And lots of people talk about learning about different cultures and learning about other worldviews and hearing people's perspectives. And I think it goes further than that for me. You need to hear it, you need to understand it, but you're also going to censor it and bring your own bias and your own lenses to it. And I think one of the examples that Dan and I actually worked on together was at the WAC Bennett Dam in Hudson's Hope, so just outside of Fort St. John, one of our historic largest dams in the province. We redid the visitor center a few years ago, and we did an exhibit called Our Story, Our Voices, and we worked with a number of the nations whose land Treaty 8 is on, and surrounding nations, and their voices are uncensored. It's completely third-party quotes, and BC Hydro did not write any content. We didn't touch it. It is what people want to say about their impact and their experience of what the company has done on their land base, and that is their story to tell. And I think for me, that's what real partnership and real relationship is. It's allowing other people's voices to be heard and giving space. And I think that just continues to grow. Like, relationships are built over time. I've had the fortune of being in these relationships for a number of years now, and in my bio, it mentions Site C. Site C is a really hard project. It's challenging, and it has impact. And people talk about, hydro energy being, very green, and it still has impacts on the land. So there's still difficult conversations to be had, and I think, what keeps me up at night and what I'm really focused on is understanding and hearing about the impacts that our heritage assets on the Peace have had on the communities, and being very cognizant of, the ability for Site C in building a third facility on the river to re-traumatize people. And so my team and my focus is really trying to spend time understanding from the communities and from the nations, how do we best support you? And what does that support look like? And what is the most culturally appropriate and sensitive way to get people ready for the impacts on the land that are coming, and for them to really understand and be part of, preparing for that and monitoring that and mitigating the impacts and dealing with, the fish and the wildlife and being on the land as that's happening. So I think that's, those are some of the things that I thought about when we were preparing for the panel. I also think broadly as a company, BC Hydro is one of the top landholders in the province as well. And I think there's lots of impacts that we have on the land, and we're also really looking at how do we get land back to First Nations. And there's been a number of examples where, whether it's on the island, after we remediated Rock Bay, the land has gone back to the nations. Patchedat First Nation, over 70 acres, has gone back to their community this year. And in areas where communities have interest in land, even if it's right around the reservoir and there's dangers with erosion, we've been able to put leases in place so that there's access to land, and the land base is going back to the communities and the territories in which it really belongs. So those were kind of the opening thoughts I had on this panel.
That's great. Thank you very much. Now we're going to move into Q&A. I am a somewhat selfish moderator. So we've got questions. I'm going to get to the questions, but I'm going to start with one of my own. And I was triggered into this question by comments from each of you. And, I'll preface this by saying, for me, developing relationships and going into business, I've always been interested when I go down that road. And I always think to myself, you know what, maybe we do a project together, maybe we don't when I meet somebody. But at the end of the day, I'm really interested in knowing whether or not this person might become a friend of mine. And even if we don't, that's the piece I want to protect, because maybe it leads to something later. I also am very interested in just having lots of people I can run into around the province, wherever I go into business, who you can greet and have a smile on your face. That's, for me, has always been one of the drivers, is the relationship piece. And, we mentioned earlier this idea that sometimes in the corporate world, we look at relationships as transactional. And so my question to each of you is, when you think about relationships and when you're in your own world and you're working along, what's the mentality you have? What is the basic mentality you have when you sit at that table with somebody you've never met before, and where you want to go, where you want to end up? And what do you think it should be? Because that's the starting place for any relationship when you first meet someone new or introducing yourself to an organization. Maynard, I'll start with you.
All right. Well, that's a deep question. I would say that, I guess from a personal standpoint, just from the values that were taught to me by my grandfather, my father, my uncles, particularly my uncles who I was fairly close with, was that when you're meeting with people or when you're talking to someone, you never know their background. So every day when I leave my home, my whole world is a perception. I have colleagues I've been working with for many years, but I don't really know them like I think I do. So when I meet people, I try to be cognizant that I don't know their history. I don't know anything about them. Because you never know what people are going through. You never know what they've gone through. You never know whether they've lost a loved one or they've been abused, or you don't know that. And I learned this from my family who has gone through residential school. Some of my members that have been taken away at a very young age, and they got a smile on their face. And, you know, it looks fine on the outside, but you truly don't know what an individual is going through and what they've gone through in their past life when you're meeting with them. That is something that that was instilled in me when I was younger, and it was instilled in me only because of what my parents had gone through, from what my grandparents had gone through by their children being taken away at a young age. You just don't know. So with that in mind, for me, is that when that brings respect. And it brings, well, more than anything, it brings respect to the person you're talking to. And so when you can be respectful to people, as we all know, the adage is, you know, do unto others as they do unto you, right? How do you want to be treated? And so that has always stuck with me.
Thank you. Good answer. Juergen, what's the mentality you go in with?
How would I like to be treated? Yeah. Number one. Number two is, you know, I'm coming here as an outsider. So I got to bring something, and I have certain expertise and certain abilities that may not be there, and they have resources and knowledge there, and unless we can find a common denominator, and particularly since we are thinking long term, even if I get over one project and it doesn't go well, if I then come back a second time, there won't be a second time. So in my perspective, we have a very large number of wind projects. If we, excuse my language, screw up as the first one, there won't be a second one. So you've got to build looking at the future, not only as a one-shot deal. And I think the corporate culture in North America is very much on public companies at the senior executive level, always dealt on the quarter-to-quarter perspective. You know, there's quarterly reports, and every quarter has to be better. In the energy industry, to me, that doesn't fit at all. I've had a public company, I'll never be public again. We're private. We're trying to make decisions on a long term. And then the other one that's important, you get engaged at a senior level. So those that can make decisions meet with those that make decisions on the other end. If you send your lackeys down below, you're just not going to get anywhere. So I think building trust and they're getting to know you is the ultimate thing. And I don't think there's anything different dealing with First Nation or anybody else. It's basic respect. How do you want to be treated? Like if you treat them nice, it's like an echo. You get treated back nice. If you treat them shitty, they treat you shitty. I mean, it seems pretty basic to me, but I don't think that's always taken. And you know, again, thinking of it from my experience, seems to have worked reasonably well. Not always, maybe, but certainly trying. Yeah.
Thank you. Dan, what's the mentality you go into new relationships with?
Thank you. A lot of the work that I do is strategic facilitation. Essentially, I help apples talk to oranges. You know, I kind of get in the middle between Indigenous peoples, the Crown, and industry, and try and manufacture common ground and trust where it doesn't exist. And the biggest, you know, takeaway for me is that, you know, relationships are the only currency that all of us trade in. You know, and relationships are the only things that really endure. And so I encourage, you know, my children and the people that I work with to really invest in the relationship. And if I'm investing in the relationship, I'm doing my homework to understand who you are and what makes you tick. I'm doing my homework so that I can be positioned in the room to treat you with the level of respect that you are, that you're deserving of. And, you know, finding ways and means that we can do that through generous listening with one another, sometimes challenging our assumptions, sometimes setting aside our mental models. But as my fellow panelists said here, you know, at the end of the day, the golden rule is you treat people the way you want to be treated. And, you know, I think part of the practice in the past as it's been related to Indigenous peoples is that we haven't been seen as equals and partners at the table. And if we've been at the table, it's been an afterthought. We've been added on like a piece of Lego where we're snapped on and snapped off to projects where it makes sense for project proponents. And essentially now, through the leadership of many of the chiefs, some of the chiefs I see sitting in the room here today have done some tremendous work with the provincial government. We have Bill 41 that is coming, and I don't think any of us should fear that. It's going to start to give us more certainty and the ability to find, ways that we can all benefit and prosper from the territories. And I think at the core of all of that is just being able to be genuine and authentic. Some of the comments that Lindsay was making in her opening comments.
Thanks, Dan. And lastly, Lindsay, mentality.
Well, I think just being curious. Like, there's so many things I don't know and I don't understand, and I think that's really important, because I think lots of people come with agendas and positions and thinking they know lots of things, and I just know that I don't, and that every day I'm faced with something that I'm challenged by and I'm learning, and I think that's a really positive way to approach building a relationship.
Okay, let's move to some of the questions. Now, the first one with the most votes is kind of sticking back to you, Lindsay, right away from BC Hydro. I'm not sure I fully understand it, so the audience member who put this in, my understanding is BC Hydro has many agreements with First Nations throughout the province. Maybe this is alluding to there should be a large one for British Columbia overall. I'm guessing that's perhaps above your pay grade to answer. But maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what's the process look like when BC Hydro is trying to move towards agreements in those communities that you're working with. What are you doing? What's the goal?
Well, it's a great question. It's a bit broad for sure. I mean, BC Hydro does have a number of agreements across different projects. I think going back to previous comments other panelists have had, BC Hydro also has relationship agreements with a number of nations. So we're not looking to just there's been lots of conversation today around impact benefit agreements and project-specific agreements, and we also want to build relationships and have broader agreements to that. And I think, when we talk about how do you get to an agreement, I think it starts by building a relationship. And to your comments around, are we going to be able to come to an agreement or not, you're not going to know that for a while, right? Like, you need to start talking about what are your interests and what are your objectives and who are you, and are there enough of those things that intersect that there's a willingness and a want to work together. And I think that from my perspective, I want people to enter into agreements and relationships because they want to. And I understand that, like, as Hydro, I'm talking as, Crown Corp, who has a monopoly, we're not going anywhere. And that doesn't mean that you're being forced into agreement. Everyone has the freedom of speech and their right to speak their mind. And, we've talked and we've heard people talk around, veto and consent. We're aiming to achieve consensus, and we're working towards that, and that is a process, and we're not always going to get it. And it's hard. And I continue to be in conversation and dialogue, and I think that's the most important thing. I also think that you can be completely opposed to a project and still have a relationship. Yeah. Like, to me, those are not mutually exclusive, and I think that's really important, because in relationship, you're not always going to agree on everything. I've never really heard of anybody who has a relationship like that, and if they do, then they probably need to work on their own self-identity. So, coming from a company perspective, we are looking long-term, and there are things that you can absolutely disagree with me on, with the company on, and we can still have a relationship, and that's the whole point.
On the you're not always going to agree on everything, my wife is a lawyer, and I've learned that while we don't agree on a lot, I lose every argument, and I've just become used to it. But hey, she's educated in that. The next question, I think this is an interesting one. I think the question that's trying to be captured here is, when does no mean no? And the question is, if a First Nation says no, is that ever accepted and respected? Do we have examples where you took that at face value and you say, you know what, okay, we're not going to try and compromise on this. I get it. The relationship matters more. We'll move on. Juergen, put up your hand to tackle that one.
A couple of first-hand examples where we came exactly in that situation. That's was my hat as a wind developer with Aeolus Wind. We have a lease on the Halfway River, and it's a long stretch of land along the ridge with good wind. And in the northern end, where the Halfway River makes a bend towards the Rockies, there is a former burial site of Old Man Lily. When we got the IUP, the investigator, we didn't know that. And during the consultation process, everything was fine, but I said, oh, there was an issue and it didn't come up. Finally, we did get the lease, and about a year later, Halfway River came to us and said, look, that's not good. We can't have that. Well, what we did is say, what would you like to do? So we sat down with them. They drew new lines. We surrendered the rest, went back to the Crown, and nothing will be built there. Likewise, we had another one. We built a Met Tower on one of the ridges at Hackney, which is on the foothills of the Rockies near the Bennett Dam. And there we found a very large rock that had a likeness of a caribou on it. Something it was man-made, other thing it was natural. I can't tell the difference, but it became an important part with Soto and with Halfway River. So we decided, again, we moved to IOP, we took it out, and got away from it. Again, trying to have a battle there is a lose-lose proposition. It doesn't make sense. Now, we've also had cases where they said no because it was a misunderstanding. For example, on one wind project, there was a consensus amongst some folks in one particular First Nation, I don't want to use names there, but they thought that when the wind doesn't blow, we have a diesel generator to turn the turbines, and they didn't want diesel generators. And I said, well, no, that's not the case, okay? There's no such thing. When the wind doesn't blow, they don't turn, they don't put out power. But they thought that you would have to put the power out continuously. Once we explained it to them, they changed their opinion. But a no, I think, is not always a full no. But you've got to try to understand where it comes from and if you can deal with it. And if you can't, you just move away.
Yep. Maynard, from the Port of Prince Rupert, when have you had a no and said, okay?
Yeah, that's a good question. In particular, we haven't had a specific project where there's been a no, but I guess my story that I can tell on this one here is I was 13 years ago, I had just joined the Port Authority, and 2 weeks prior to the container terminal was converted from a break bulk facility to a container terminal. And I think I was 3 days on a job, and the president and CEO walked into my office. He tapped on the doorpost and got my attention. It says, there's going to be a roadblock at Scott Road. Can you take care of it? And walked away, walked out of the office and went back to his office. And he thought he was joking. But what he was talking about is we were, there had been plans to have a celebration opening the container terminal. And it was quite a large celebration. And what prior to me joining the Port Authority, and it was no fault of anyone's, but unbeknownst to the executive team and to the team that was planning the event, did not reach out to the First Nation communities and invite them to the event. There was no, what I discovered, there was no engagement to ask them to welcome the world, literally the world, to their traditional territory. So that no to block the road wasn't a no, we don't want it. It was just finding out and talking to the individuals as to why they were saying no. And once I discovered that what the why was all about, and it was just a matter of saying, my God, you know what, we apologize, please, we need you at the event. It's your traditional territory. So we invited them, and I called one of the hereditary chiefs and I said, I'll leave it up to you. You decide who needs to be there. That's not up to us or me to decide who should do the welcome. That is totally up to you. And just take the names of all the chiefs and all the drummers and the dancers that you think need to be there, and just make a list. If I need to get a bus, and we'll get a bus. And so I left it with him, and it worked out great.
Thank you. I'm going to get into the next question. It's got 12 votes. I want to go to you, Dan, on this one. I'm going to put a little twist on it. So the question is, how do you foster a corporate culture that supports investing time and resources to build a relationship with First Nations groups? When I look at this question, I think to myself, yeah, corporate culture, we talk a lot about that around time and resources. But what's interesting is that when I develop a relationship with any one of you, I'm not leading with the Trust's corporate culture. I'm not picking up the phone and saying, Dan, this is our corporate culture. That's what I want to lead with. I'm leading with me, as my team is leading with themselves. It's actually my personal culture. And that's where we're starting the relationship. And I wonder, so how, I guess the question, you've probably seen a lot of this in your career, which is building that corporate culture, but how does the personal bridge into that to really develop the relationship between the two individuals who might ultimately be in that decision-making role or might end up in that friction position, and the strength of that personal relationship that's supported by the corporate culture can get through the tough times?
Yeah, every project requires a champion, right? It's somebody who's going to be the focal point for it. But I like to talk about culture because, you know, in my settings, we talk a lot about Indigenous culture, you know, our traditional ways of knowing, being, seeing, and doing as Indigenous people. But organizations have cultures as well, and it can be defined as, you know, the tone at the top or the way we do things around here. And I think what I'm starting to witness is a change afoot, particularly within corporate culture, where you know, there's a design mantra that people are starting to adopt that I think is really important about going slow to go fast as it relates with relationships. And you can see those projects or those initiatives that have gotten a significant way down the field, they've done that because they have taken the time to invest in relationships with one another. And I think, you know, you've heard all of us say that over and over again here is all about how do you maintain proper relationships. You also need people, you know, directly to your question, you also need people within your respective infrastructures who can walk in both worlds, you know, who have the ability to move seamlessly within corporate culture as well as within Indigenous culture. You know, shapeshifters, if you will, that can go back and forth and do the, you know, the shuttle diplomacy that is necessary to try and bridge the differences that you have. And, you know, I think we spend too much time talking about our differences. And I remember when I was a treaty negotiator for the Office of the Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chiefs and really high tension and racism and discrimination happening in the community of Smithers. And when I would go and meet with the Chamber of Commerce, I would never talk about what we have as differences. I would always start about what we have in common. When you think about what we have in common, we all want to raise our children in the communities that they've been born. We all want jobs. We all want good housing. We all want clean water. You know, we all want gainful employment. And I think that if we start to focus on those things that we have in common, those differences start to fade away. But again, at the end of the day, you need somebody who's going to champion the relationship that has street cred with both parties.
Thanks, Dan. I want to move over to you, Lindsay. And what do you think about that notion from a hydro perspective of going slow to going fast, or going slow to go fast, and this idea of common ground and focusing on that?
Well, I mean, I think we try and do both. I think when you're, you know, the question around, you know, how do you change corporate culture? And, you know, it kind of goes back to your Dan's comments around like Lego and bolt-ons. Well, you could use a similar analogy with Indigenous relations departments in big companies, right? And I think for me and for Hydro, there's been a huge turn of the dial where Indigenous relations is not just a separate department. It is in the DNA of the entire company. The relationships are not just a specific group of people engaging with First Nations. And that means that before we even think of the idea and we know we're going to have customers and we don't even know what we're going to do to electrify them, we're having the conversation of what's going on in your territory and your region, because it's embedded in the entire life cycle of the company. It is not something that happens when you get to a project or you need to access land for some reason. So I think that, you know, in order for companies to go slow, they need to embed it throughout their entire life cycle of what they do, because you still have the realities of being able to move at the speed of business, right? Yeah. And the Premier talked about that at lunch, like we need to move at the speed of business. You can do that, and you can go slow and build meaningful relationships. So I think you just have to be thoughtful about how you do that.
Yeah, great answer. The next question is, what are the trickiest elements of collaborating with Indigenous nations? How do you overcome them? I think we're looking for specific things that perhaps are common to many Indigenous communities, but perhaps the answer is that you have to learn where you are and who you're working with individually. I'm going to start with you, Dan, on this one, because you have a lot of experience coming from that word. What are some of the things that perhaps you've seen the corporation or the community that's trying to engage with Indigenous communities, where have they tripped up?
I think the biggest trip up has been baking the project before you come to the community. and having some preconceived notions about what success should look like and how the Indigenous group should respond. And you know, our people are alive to that and resist that, and want to make sure that whatever is being developed, you know, to Lindsay's point, you know, when the idea is just starting to germinate, you should be starting to talk with the Indigenous community whose territories that you're going to be operating your project in. And, you know, I was going to give a really flippant answer, you know, and I think at the end of the day, it's all about respect, right? Yeah. You know, respect for who we are as individuals, respect for our different worldviews, you know, and oftentimes we don't do enough of that, you know, and I think we have a good way of othering people where if you don't look like me or you don't act like me, then I don't make space for you at the table here. And I'm really, really happy over the latter part of my career here to see a lot of changes that are happening, not only within Indigenous systems, but within corporate systems and governmental systems as well, where we're starting to get it right. You know, and I think that there's lots of really good examples that are out here in the audience right now about how things can be done properly. And I think we just need to start leveraging those opportunities to greater advantage for all of us.
Yep. Maynard, I want to go to you on this one too. I mean, you gave an example earlier on Port-au-Prince Rupert when you first started, but in your experience too, where have you seen some of those trip-ups? What specific examples do you have?
Well, I think that, you know, this is a very complex topic. Maybe we've made it more complex than what it needs to be. But I always go back and think about kind of the relationship, right? I think the importance, at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We all have feelings. And we've evolved into this rapidly evolved into this world of where we are trying to come together, where you got your Indigenous culture and the corporate culture that we've been talking about, and that they're living in two different worlds, right? So, of course, you know, the corporate culture has to operate at the speed of business. It's just the way it is. The Indigenous culture is operating in this kind of world of reconciliation, right? They're still kind of reeling from history, but they both truly, and I've seen this, those two worlds are really wanting to come together. But there's still that gap there where there's still some lack of trust. And that, you know what, it's the way history is dealt the Indigenous people. But everyone wants, at the end of the day, wants a quality of life. We all want the same thing. And we had this conversation earlier. Yep. And we say, okay, so there's a layer of us that are, say, in our 60s and our 70s and 80s that have been leaders, and whether we're on elected council or hereditary leaders, that have lived this history that hasn't been so good. But there's that next layer of maybe the next generation that I believe need to drive this bus. They need to hop in the driver's seat and take this issue on another road. Because the bus that we're all on right now, we're still trying to figure out, are we on this right road? How do we get on the right road? But I truly think that this next generation, the next generation below us, will make that decision, needs to make that decision. And whether you're Indigenous or whether you're in a corporate environment or whatever walk of life you're coming from, it needs to be that generation that hops on in the driver's seat and takes that bus onto this new road where we're working together, we're building trust, we're making an effort. Because if you think about companies that are wanting to build a major project, the millions of dollars that get invested in engineering, concept designs, hiring the right people, investing in transportation and so forth, and then you go to them and you say, what is the most important part of your project? And they'll tell you, it's our engagement with the First Nation people. And then you look around and say, well, you've got 100 people on staff, and you've got one person that you've hired as your person that's the Indigenous engagement person. And so that one person, and you're telling me that is the most important part of your project, is Indigenous engagement, and you have put very little money into that department, and you've only got one person. I think we need to rethink on the words that we say. Words are easy to say, but it's the action that needs to align with what we're saying. Because if you're a big company and you're going into the traditional territories of the Indigenous people, and you're telling me that this is the most important part of our project, of our company, but you've only got one person that is going to do the engagement, but yet you're spending millions of dollars to get the land, to get your project done, and you're doing all that work, but the First Nations, they're still trying to figure it out. Why are you telling me you're spending millions of dollars, but you get one person, and no disrespect, they're blonde, blue eyes, and they're coming to our community, or they haven't even been into our community. They invited us into the boardroom. And I said, relationships do not start in a boardroom. They do not happen in a boardroom or in the band office. Relationships happen in a common place, a third space. Go for a cup of coffee. Go sit around the campfire. Go to a feast hall. That's where the relationship happens. If you think you've got a relationship with an Indigenous community because you've been to the band office 10 times, I'll tell you, you don't have a relationship. It doesn't happen in there.
Good words. We're getting to time, but there's one question that I want to get to, and I'm going to throw it out there. Anybody can speak to this. It's got the most votes. The question is it reasonable to expect that First Nations must make changes too? Now, my experience in working with Indigenous communities at the province is that they're changing rapidly, and some of the challenges keeping up with all of the change. I think perhaps the question is, what are the changes that we're seeing that were happening, or you're seeing happening on the Indigenous side in terms of how you approach this conversation around relationships and partnerships? And Dan, you mentioned something that really resonated with me. We talked about this in advance in the panel, this notion of wellness and well-being being the goal. And so I hate to put you on the spot, but the question is, what are some of the changes that you're seeing coming on the Indigenous side that perhaps the rest of us need to know about? And anybody else can pick up on this afterwards. But Dan, to you first.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that the question here, is it reasonable to expect that First Nations must make changes too? Of course. I think we're all in this together. And I think all of us have to learn more about one another, because we are all here to stay. And I think what I'm starting to see with our young people within our communities, that they're getting more higher education. They're getting more sophisticated in terms of the work that we're doing. We're gaining business acumen exponentially. And, we want to be part of the economy. Poverty is not an Aboriginal right. And I think poverty is normalized in far too many of our families, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And I think we have to do more on that front. And so I'm really pleased with the leadership that is being provided by our elected and hereditary chiefs. But I'm more impressed by the young people that are coming forward, getting an education. Many of them you see are working within the companies here and are starting to work within the different systems and are taking their Indigenous worldview and embedding it in different organizations. Many of my colleagues do work within BC Hydro and other places. And I guess the thing for me is that we all just want to belong to something, right? We all just want to be respected, and at the end of the day. And big announcements are being made at this forum here, and at the core of all those announcements has been the relationships that my fellow panelists have been talking about here today. And so invest in the relationships, and be patient, and be persistent at the end of the day. And one final point, when I was the BC Business Council seems to be pretty focused on making sure that they talk to the right people within our communities, because who do you talk to? Elected, hereditary? Do you talk to them both? And also getting a greater understanding about the speed of how we make decisions. Our decision-making process is a little bit more inclusive and a little bit more slower than yours, so you need to make the space and time for that to occur.
Thank you. Lindsay, final words from you on the topic of what changes you're seeing?
Well, I think, the question I thought was great. Like, can you expect people to make change? I think regardless of who you are, if we're going to do things differently, if we're going to build relationship, if we're going to learn about each other, if we're going to learn how to work together, that means everyone needs to be open to making change. So I think that that's fundamental to transforming the way we partner and do business.
Yeah, change is good, donkey.
You just called me a donkey?
We're developing good relationships up here now.
We're starting to break down up here.
All right, let's. Hey, Juergen, we're going to put you in the hot seat coming out of that one. Juergen, final words from you.
Well, I'd like to perhaps bring a different perspective. BC is a very unique place. A lot of the projects require a lot of capital, and that doesn't come all from BC. So international organizations and other countries have a very different view of dealing with these issues. And there is a perspective in the Far East and in Europe and in the United States that local community engagement is something that happens on the site and is part of a permitting process. You tick a few boxes, you have an open house, and you're done. You go to Europe and you have to explain to people that there's First Nation consultation. At first they look at you and say, oh my God. So you got to explain to them, and the fact of the matter is the capital comes largely from elsewhere. So we have a challenge there. So the mindset we have here in BC, which we seem to be all accustomed to and comfortable with and agree with it, we have to have a dialogue, but the impact it has on projects is very hard to convey to the outside world. And it's something that we should be aware of, that we are probably an outlier internationally in terms of how far the engagement is. And I'm not in any way critical of it, I'm just observing it. The outside world is at a different level. Somebody asks you, are we catching up at the bottom? Well, I think we're way ahead. Yeah. That's my perspective anyway. I mean, it's limited, but especially with the Orientals, it's very difficult.
Thank you. Last word, Maynard.
It's the generation where my parents came from. You never questioned your elders because it was disrespectful. You just listened. And so growing up, people made decisions with very little information. And so, like, the question is, what are the changes that we're seeing with the Indigenous people? And I'll go back to Dan's comment. He's absolutely right. It's the knowledge, it's the education, because I think for the hereditary leaders, and I see this, for the hereditary leaders and the elders that are kind of the ones that hold the power in the community, that are making the decisions, they are making decisions and they're uninformed. They're making the final decision and they're uninformed. They don't have all the information that they need to make that decision, but they're making the final decision. This new generation that's coming out, they've got questions. And for us growing up, you don't ever ask, you don't even question when an elder talks, you don't question them. Even if you're curious and you have a question about just because of your curiosity, you don't question them. That's disrespectful. But this new generation that's growing up in the urban centers haven't experienced that. So they're like, they want to know everything, right? They're curious and they want to know. Great. So now they are informed. So going back to, they're educated and they're informed. And that's what you need for corporate Canada and the Indigenous leaders to come together, is that everyone is informed so you can make the right decision as opposed to the best decision.
Great words to leave it on. Well, I think, based on this conversation, we could keep going for hours. However, my good friend Kevin tells me there's a reception with possibly drinks outside. So for those audience members, perhaps we can continue these conversations informally with the panelists outside. I want to thank all the audience members for the questions. Thank our panelists. Can we have a round of applause for these folks? Thank you.